Thank you everyone for joining us. Good afternoon and welcome to this evening's lecture with Jesse Reiser of the acclaimed New York design practice, Reiser and Umemoto, RUR Architecture. To start this introduction, I wanted to say why, for me, this event holds much significance in a time of competing and often divisive agendas in architecture. I'm trying to get the volume right. Jesse and his partner Nanako exemplify a term that often gets used to differentiate academic practices. In subtle and obvious ways, they occupy the often elusive space of critical practice. Theirs is a conglomeration of skills and scholarship, carefully crafted in thought and execution. You will see large buildings. You will see large buildings of cultural significance alongside speculative and experimental works. They publish books that inspire students and challenge the discipline. They lay out those suppositions in writings, models, drawings, exhibitions, competitions, and with steadfast commitment, they design and build ambitious buildings. They ask open-ended questions, as you will experience today. It is a privilege to welcome Jesse here for the school's 2024 inaugural lecture. Entitled Weaponized Craft, this is a talk exploring craft-based engagement and technology, among many other topics. Jesse Reiser is a professor of architecture at Princeton University. He received his Bachelor of Architecture degree from the Cooper Union in New York and completed his Master of Architecture at the Cranbrook Academy of Art. He was a Fellow of the American Academy in Rome, and he worked for the offices of John Haydock and Aldo Rossi prior to forming Reiser and Umemoto with partner Nanako. He has previously taught at various schools in the US and Asia, including Columbia University, Yale University, Ohio State University, Hong Kong University, and the Cooper Union. And he has also lectured widely at various educational and cultural institutions throughout the United States, Europe, and Asia. Reiser and Umemoto, RUR Architecture, is an internationally recognized multidisciplinary design firm with buildings at a wide range of scales. They published the Atlas of Novel Tectonics in 2006, a seminal book that sat on the studio desks of many architecture students around the world. They have won and built international competitions, the Taipei Pop Music Center, and the Kaohsiung Port Terminal. O14, a 22-story exoskeletal office tower in Dubai, received numerous international honors, including the Concrete Industry Award of Merit and the American Council of Engineering Companies Diamond Award. Their work bridges the divide, where experimental work is recognized by traditional building industries and provides a vision of possibilities in our built work. The firm completed 2 comprehensive monographs of their work, the O14 Projection and Reception, with AA Publications, and most recently, Projects and Their Consequences. The work of Reiser and Umemoto has been published and exhibited widely, including the fact that they were awarded the Chrysler Award for Excellence in Design. Jesse and Nanako received the Academy Award in Architecture by the American Academy of Arts and Letters. They were also awarded the Presidential Citation from President George Campbell of the Cooper Union for outstanding practical and theoretical contributions in the field of architecture. They were honored with the John Haydock Award, also from the Cooper Union, and recently Jesse and Nanako were the recipients of the USA Booth Fellowship from United States Artists for Architecture and Design. In academia, they were seminal figures at Columbia in the paperless studio days that many of us remember. While embracing this growth of architectural form, they were distinguished among their peers by persistent craftsmanship, drawings and models translated into a computer model rather than the generation of materials divorced from disciplinary foundations of plans, sections, and details. On a personal note, it was in 1998 when I was in Cambridge at the Cambridge Architectural Bookstore with Sung Ho, my then friend and now partner. And we discovered the book along with a foreword from Daniel Libeskind. And I want to read a couple things. He said, as architects, we are apt to regard diagramming in terms of either the fixed norms of classical geometry and typology, or as reductive descriptions of programmatic or functional relationships. Bubble diagramming. If, however, we shift our focus from static models to dynamic, essentially time-based systems, then an entirely new horizon of possibility emerges. The visual forces of this expression have changed, but the foresight absolutely remains, and our need for thinking in time-based terms. From the introduction of the same volume, he says, today's architecture falls as easily into categories as little spheres. Those few who have another ambition, who think independently, have a vision that comes from some other space, and are by and large delegated to the role of the dreamer, the theorist, or the academic. They constitute the margins of architecture, and their work is deemed an irrelevant supplement. This is not a lecture about an irrelevant supplement. Jesse is squarely embedded in the discipline, with writing, making, modeling, drawing, thinking, educating, and building. It is rare for someone in our profession to be so ambidextrous, with talent flowing in so many interrelated dimensions. It's a complete honor to have him here today, and I want to welcome Jesse Reiser.
Good afternoon. Heather, thank you for the generous introduction. It's really wonderful to be here in Austin. It's my first time, so I have to get a view of the city and of the people and all that's going on before I leave. I wanted to open my talk today with material that, while it's been part of our practice, has been largely unsaid, probably since the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. But it's something that Nanako and I felt was very important to communicate because, particularly because we're associated with digital technologies, which is sort of true, sort of not. There was a prior, almost beginning of a career that was entirely analog. And in addition to that, considered subjects that, dare I say it, are almost taboo in the current discourse. So I have a short preamble, and I won't go into it too much, along with a text that you probably won't be able to read in its entirety, but I really encourage the students certainly to look at it. And that is a short story, it's only about a page long, by Franz Kafka, entitled The Cares of a Family Man. But anyway, I'm going to probably cause a bit of overlap and static because I'm going to be reading another statement along with it, but bear with me. Yeah, so I wanted to start with a subject that has not been a common part of architectural discourse, let alone practice, since the mid-'80s. And there has been an allergy, bordering on taboo, on discussing matters of spirit in architecture. theorist Sanford Quinter has been inspired to write on this issue after an esteemed colleague in history voiced surprise, almost contempt, at his mention of spirit in relation to the notion of a peak experience at a symposium in Amherst that we both attended in 2022. You were there as well. Yeah. It's a strange turn when we realize that Le Corbusier celebrated the spiritual in his term, the ineffable, in his 1948 essay on the New World of Space. And I speak for myself and Nanako as well, since we've been such close collaborators, that we share in our respective backgrounds an unspoken understanding of the life that animates spaces, nature, and things. It underpins all of our architectural judgments and resides comfortably alongside the rational factors that architects wrestle with on a daily basis. It runs from a perception of a potential energy in things, almost an animism, I would say, to the material liveliness in musical instruments or bicycle frames. We mean this as a preamble, and I promise not to talk further on the subject. After all, architecture is essentially a mute practice, and spirit is better felt than said. So I wanted to talk about the three projects that we have been involved with in Taiwan really since the early 2000s. Two of them have been constructed and built. This is the Taipei Music Center. And one we won in competition, but was never built. But I think it was very important because it was, for us, one of the first times we began to speculate on and look at issues of sustainability, perhaps in a slightly different way than what I'm seeing today. But anyway, I'll start with the Taipei Music Center. It was put out in competition at the end of 2009. Very interesting because the government at first of Taiwan keenly realized that there were upstarts all over Asia, mainly from China and Korea, that were creating their own popular music centers and music. And while they were among the first, the Taiwanese, to start a music industry after the Japanese, they felt that it was very important to kind of reassert their industry, to bring together a diverse group of producers and artists who were mainly located around Taipei in one complex. So it's an interesting place because it isn't merely a performance space, but it's actually intended for the kind of creation of new groups, the kind of production of music, as well as the performance of music. And so it incorporates all of those things within one neighborhood. They wanted really to create a distinctive architecture for the industry that would be immediately recognizable to anyone, certainly in Taiwan, but also, I guess, mainly all over Asia, that it actually had a place. So it's located in a somewhat edge area called Nangang. There are no proper suburbs in Taipei. You actually have a very interesting situation where areas that were once farmland had become developed as industry first, and you can see that rail yard at the base of the image. And then over time, industry is being replaced with new, cultural and educational complexes along and abutting these kind of low, verdant hills. So you get this radical juxtaposition between the city and nature, basically, which, I thought was super exciting. Our original competition entry was very different from what we ultimately built. This was a really long, sustained project, and there were a lot of different voices. It moved from government control, where they were sort of hedging their bets, I would say, about the performance space itself. They wanted a hybrid hall that could, carry Broadway-type shows as well as, popular and classical music. These hybrids are not really very good because they're never really good at any one thing. And then over time, the music industry essentially took over the project, moved away from the Ministry of Culture and the government, and the music industry people had a very different notion of what their center, should be like and how it should be programmed, and even the size of the audiences they expected. So we basically had to stop. The initial scheme was stopped, and then we restarted again. But this initial scheme basically had the components are all there, even in the final project. There's a main hall. This cubic space at the bottom was to be and is now a museum, but also is used for all kinds of educational functions and so forth. And then the third component is a musical production facility, which also serves as a kind of overhang for the outdoor performance space. But in this iteration, we had a robot theater that moved along a rail in this project and would handle various scales of audience in this park space. So what you're seeing is the most extended version, and that robot stage would actually come and what we called kiss the cube for very small audiences and performances. Anyway, that part of the project was eliminated for financial reasons. It was determined that the kind of changeable robot would cost more than the budget for the whole project. At least that's what we were told. And then the music industry was interested in a very different kind of form of performance. So anyway, but I put this in also because the form of the main hall, which you will see in a few minutes, is connected to our Kaohsiung port terminal in terms of its sort of formal genesis. And I'll explain that too. So this was, right, 2009, 2010. Social media had not yet sort of blossomed and come onto the scene, but we did understand, and this was a kind of a slide we used in the competition, that the building not only would be experienced in person in the flesh, but it would be represented in media, and it was very important for the industry that it, have that kind of presence as an iconic, recognizable center. And this is an animation that we made, which really tries to communicate the two basic elements of the project. First, a kind of ground-based fabric, which then supports the three major kind of functional components of the site. So you have a kind of low ground fabric, and then the three elements. There was a lot of work after the competition was presented. We were told to expect 10 years of hell. It wasn't so bad, but still, it was not an easy project because it also, because Taiwan is truly a democratic place, public interaction and presentations were very important, and feedback, and reactions from the music industry and reactions from the kind of local community, and so all of those things were very much part of the project. Yeah, this is just a comparison between the main hall in our first proposal, the tri-lobe of the main hall, and then our Kaohsiung port terminal. So there has been, and I'll show in a moment, a kind of obsession and interest in the tri-lobe model, going back to our competition for the Cardiff Bay Opera House competition, which I believe Zaha Hadid won, but never built, somewhere around 1994, 95. But the theoretical, or in a way, the performative argument here is that we could take a theater form and essentially flip the arrows of view. In the theater, the lobes look at and converge at the stage. In the port terminal, the entrance becomes the stage, and then you actually look out at the lobes and head towards the ship. So it's basically the kind of reversal of the light ray. And as I said, we did a lot of physical model making, studying over the years, studying the tri-lobe. So the foreground image is the Cardiff Bay Opera House project, and then there are later studies dealing with the Music Center, and finally the Kaohsiung. And here you can see some of the plans. So the Melnikov-Rusakov Workers Club inspired the project, although with Cardiff Bay, we actually looked at a project actually done by a Texas firm called CRS. Some of you may know it. I don't know if it's still in business, but they came up with a really novel way of thinking about acoustics, fusing shoebox halls around one stage, and so you wouldn't have long echoes. So there was an acoustical logic as well, to that form, which I'm sure derives at some level from Melnikov. Anyway, as I said, once the project began, there was a lot of stakeholders. So our local architects, Fei and Cheng, were really instrumental on many levels in the project. We're a relatively small firm, and they really brought, the manpower and, being on the ground in Taiwan. They mainly, honestly, navigated the political dimension of this project, which, would have evaporated without their active, participation. But we also worked with the music industry. They educated us a lot on how a music center works, how, for example, red carpets are staged, and all of the things that actually, deal with the functioning of these places. So it was interesting, too, that on the one hand, for us, a very strong formal and spatial driver would be brought into relationship with really hard constraints, technical constraints and functional constraints, and that the two are really not, I would argue, in conflict, but that it's actually very useful to have a very strong spatial and structural idea before absorbing and responding to those kinds of functional issues. So in other words, not bubble diagramming functions, but actually coming with a formal and structural idea and then have it be transformed by those constraints. So yeah, this is all of the kind of outreach and all of the kind of processes, the head of the music center, all of those people. One of the things that was really interesting too is that once it got to the music industry and out of the government's hands, they increased the scale of the main hall from, I think, 3,000 seats to over 5,000, and they wanted to sell tickets. So that forced a radical revision. We moved away from the lobe-based theater and Also because in the popular music, it was very important from their perspective for everybody in the audience to see everyone else. So we went more towards a fan-shaped hall as opposed to segregated lobes that cut the audience off from one another. So it's less intimate in a way, but it's more communal experience. But this is a diagram of the basic functions. Another, as I mentioned, this development really is a chunk of city. It's an urban design first, and then after that, it's about the specific architecture. And one of the things that was very important to the music industry was the opportunity to have outdoor performances, to make, and for us, it was very important to make those outdoor spaces fully public. A lot of the other competitors, in a way, moved towards an OMA model for solving the problem. In other words, making one massive building which could contain, sound and everything, but the argument of a building acting like the city, which it never really can. So we decided, well, we're just going to do a piece of city. It wouldn't be a representation of city, it would just be a piece of city. And it would, the ambition was to make it really open to the public. Functions like markets and night markets and all of those kinds of things would happen in the plazas. And then on the occasions when there would be performance, outdoor performance, those areas could be closed and controlled and used for, a performance purpose. The other thing was an aesthetic driver, which relates to that whole idea of a ground fabric and objects, that the kind of idea of silhouette became really important, especially because many of the performances would be happening in twilight or at night. And so you would be, in a way, there would be an elevated ground, almost mountain-like ground of fabric, and then the elements of the main elements, the cube, the main hall, and then the rehearsal building, technical building, would sit on that elevated artificial ground, and it would be, you'd be able to orient yourself in the complex that way. And this is a rendering of it. The other thing that was interesting here, that it wasn't one site, but it was actually two. And so Taipei, there's almost a typology of elevated walkways in Taipei that are used to connect sites, and they come in with a kind of modernist idea of separating the pedestrian and the vehicular. And so the main hall, our proposal placed the main hall on the opposite side of the road, of a main road, to the rest of the complex. And so we had to create a bridge that would connect in to the main hall. It became a kind of elevated second floor entrance for the public, as well as a ground floor entrance, which would be used for various events. The other thing that we were working with was the idea of these kind of artificial, almost stupa-like constructions at the kind of ground building. And so we were looking at those, as well as the idea of the kind of the eave, the overhang of the building, as a kind of production, something that would produce a figure against the sky. And then that ground structure would contain mainly back-of-house functions. So that lump that you see here has a big portal into it, and what is beyond is actually the press area for the project. So there's a ribbed concrete vault that contains the press area. All of this is mainly back-of-house functioning, and then front of house has another set of approaches. This is the outdoor performance space that would handle about 1,500 people, and the staircase could also be used for seating. The overhang that you see on the right is where bands would set up, and I'll show you some of the events by that. And then this is another view, really kind of the purist architect's view of this space. The music people have a very different notion of what animates the space, and I'll show that in a second, but this is, yeah, the kind of classical architect's view of symmetry. This is how they advertise it. And there's just continuous, production around that stuff. And they use these, public spaces for demonstrations, too. So I think it's been, quite successful, that we were able to argue for public space in the complex. Yeah, I mean, it keeps developing, it keeps changing. It really, over time as retail and other kinds of shops, begin to develop in the space, it becomes more and more part of the city, becomes accepted into the city. And then, the music center is also used for advertising continuously. Various people and companies use the center. And art installations as well. So they have a very active kind of curatorial program. And it's nice to know that, in a way, it's not our job to do that. It's something that it goes over to them, and they do it so well. And influencers use it to advertise themselves. And swag and products, art installations. So this is a strange Duchamp urinal inflatable on the left, and an Audi ad on the right. But one of the things that also interested us in the project was a way of returning to the issues of symmetry in architecture. And it came, I think, mainly for us from film, Wes Anderson, or Kubrick, that it would be important in a way not to have the place too sweet, if I can say that there was a certain edge to the symmetry, a certain character to the space, which would, I think, in a way, it comes from the experience of having worked with Aldo Rossi in the mid-'80s, I would say. There was a very different discussion around the classical and around the use of symmetry, which in a way was not about, not connected to my mind to postmodernism. But, of course, Rossi has been associated. I mean, Sylvia Levin has done that. But certainly a very different notion of how to retrieve those kinds of issues than, say, Venturi. Or, even kind of moving into the Art Nouveau.
还是酒摊，非常多的
The
酒
other
摊，
thing
也
that
可以瘦吧？
we felt
要
very
加纳豆
strongly
才好吃
about,
哦。
because everyone is interested
好，
in
这边有古
bottom-up
着，台虎
urbanism,
精酿。
is that for a project like this, we don't design that. We create a place for that to happen, because the entrepreneurs are so much better than the architects at doing that. But the importance of having those things happen in the complex was something that we discussed, with the stakeholders a lot. The other thing was about, how we treat the architecture in terms of the color and the cladding. At first, we colored all the buildings, and instead, at a certain point, we pulled away from that and instead began to think of color, because color is very important for performance, would mainly be created through light, through, the way they would actually produce a mood for the specific performance. So we didn't go to a silver cladding. We went to something golden, which is very recognizable in Japan. It's a product called alumite. It was a very, an old-fashioned form of anodizing kind of created in the 1930s. And while the cladding, honestly, is from Holland, we tried to find the closest thing to the color of the alumite, because it was originally designed as a cladding for aircraft, as a kind of a camouflage that would reflect ambient light in a way differently than silver. The other thing was how we detailed the cladding of the building. And because I'm an aviation buff, I started looking at corrugated systems. This is a detail from a Junkers airliner. And in contrast, say, to architects that want to make buildings look cheap by using corrugated, this is like an insane way of detailing and making connections in these kinds of cladded systems. It's really kind of tour de force of detailing. And so it's very inspired by that. Ultimately, the building that we did is standing seam, but a very similar kind of problem of the kind of striated cladding and how to join and connect pieces. So this is a view of the main kind of windows, view from the elevated entry off the bridge and then down low. So you can see here Nanako standing there on the second level entry. So it's a bi-level kind of way of getting into the building, either at grade or from the bridge. And then this is the ground level view of the building, where they have the red carpet events and so forth. The view of the main hall, a 5,000-seat main hall. And one of the early performances, the test performances. But here you can kind of see also the effect where once in this main plaza, you get the roofs and you get a kind of, all of the lower buildings are kind of blocked, and then you get a horizon with the object buildings and then the hills beyond. Okay, I'm going to do a short description of a much earlier project, which we made in Taiwan also, which we won but never got built, for the Alishan Mountain Railroad, which is one of the two kind of famous mountain railroads in the world, I think. There's one in India, of course, Switzerland, but the one in Taiwan was built by the Japanese, originally as a logging railroad. They were actually removing massive hinoki pines from Taiwan during the colonial period in the 30s, or 20s and 30s, for temple columns. And then after the war, this mountain railroad kind of shifted over to being a tourist rail line to visit some famous sites up in the mountains. But it was a very interesting kind of site because it was, I think, about 70 kilometers long and then wound its way up the mountain, so went from essentially tropical forest at the base up almost to the tree line. So you got a really interesting environmental gradient. And I identified this logic which correlates altitude and latitude. And one of the charges in this competition, since it was first a planning competition and then an architecture competition, was to address the maintenance and also what would happen along the line of this long linear railroad. And so we came up with a series of programs for restaurants from derelict that would be created in these derelict stations that need to be revamped, and also the kind of things that would grow at those altitudes that would supply the restaurants. So the first iteration was more representational in a way and became more international. So you theoretically would have food from France at a certain altitude, and food from various countries could have growing things happening at particular altitudes. Ultimately, we moved away from that, and it was simply about what could be grown and what could supply restaurants in these zones. And they would also, in addition to this, and I think it's really important here also to say that the architecture, while it had to be very sensitive to these sites, was essentially had to be conceived of as something different. You had to have a very strong attitude, I would say, about the form and construction and the materials of the architecture. Just the logic of the ecology wouldn't be enough. So I think that was really important for us, that you couldn't simply do an analysis at one level and assume it would produce an architecture. You would actually actively have to bring architectural models to those environmental conditions to get something productive. So this was a bridge, as an example, that we designed. It first was proposed as a wooden bridge, and then we were informed that, in fact, the bridge would only last 3 years because of the termite situation in Taiwan. So it shifted to a steel bridge. But anyway, there was a prototype model, which we called the newborn calf, that was shown at the Venice Biennale in the early 2000s, which was really more a geometry model than a structural model, but it was our kind of first exploration into this. It's from a British grid shell company helped us. Okay, so this is the final project I'll be presenting this evening, the Kaohsiung Port Terminal, which we won in competition around 2011. Also a very long kind of process of design and building. But in contrast to the music center, the essential design didn't change. It was a Ministry of Transportation, much easier to work with in a way, with the engineers than Ministry of Culture and all of those people. And there was even a Lego set made. This is one of the largest container port in Taiwan. This is in southern Taiwan. And it was designed both to create a tower for the Port Authority of Kaohsiung Harbor, but also to handle large cruise ships as well as fast ferries and various other kinds of boats that would dock in the project. It, for us, was actually the culmination of a research project that we began in the 90s dealing with edge conditions in cities. And so we received the Van Allen Institute research grant to do a proposal for the edge of east side of Manhattan. And we were very interested in this very interesting moment in the city where you were off the grid. You were, in a way, contending with an existing highway, the FDR Drive, but to create an elevated, public space that would be continuous, but at the same time would address the local conditions of the communities and their sort of wishes. So that was, a project, again, that we started with, and then further explored in the West Side Convergence Project, which was part of the IFCCA's competition for the design of cities. So this is what became Hudson Yards was at first a kind of highfalutin design competition with Peter Eisenman and UN Studio and various other architects trying to reconsider what could happen with that rail yard site. But again, it was about thinking of the city not as a single kind of plane, but New York, in a way, is a piece of megastructure by default. It deals with multiple layered grounds that, over time developed, and to kind of work with that as a sectional notion was really important for us. So we brought those logics to bear on our proposal for the Kaohsiung Port Terminal. Again, like the other Taiwanese competitions, it was a planning project before it was an architectural project. And so ideally, our sort of, our edge logic could extend all the way around the harbor and would have to connect, to various locally and, in a way, globally to the infrastructure with pedestrian space. It was really an ambition in Kaohsiung to bring public space to what was an industrial waterfront. So there was a larger logic of cruise ship lines, started actually early on with more connections to lines in Asia, particularly mainland China. That shifted more now to Japan, and depending upon the political situation, that may shift again. But as I mentioned, various scales and types of ships. And then we brought that idea of a kind of sandwich logic to the design of this terminal, so that industry wouldn't be, it wasn't a post-industrial project. Industry had to still function in Kaohsiung. It would simply be the superimposition of more systems on top of it, so that the public space would be above, would kind of look out over the harbor and still allow for all of the industrial and terminal functions to happen beneath. That was inspired by Carl Schurz Park on the edge of Manhattan, where you have these fantastic kind of lookouts and the FDR Drive running underneath. And that logic then extended into the building itself. So what you see in blue is a kind of elevated public esplanade that we had hoped would go on forever. And then a kind of middle sandwich level, which would be the main level of the terminal. And then finally, a kind of departure hall at the lowest most level, with also baggage handling, all of that. In a way, based on airport design, too. I mean, very much like an airport terminal. And the idea, too, is that you could have both the kind of local public use this place, and travelers who necessarily had to be in more kind of clean zones could also use it as well. So it would be used for the everyday life of the city, as well as for, the periodic use, with the cruise ships and the ferries and so forth. This was an old industrial site. It was first developed during the colonial period by the Japanese, and they built a huge oil kind of tank farm on the site, which we discovered when they started to dig the foundations. They actually hit a lake of oil. We did some research, and this was the big Mitsubishi tank farm. It was really one of the major ports for the Imperial Japanese Navy, with all of the really huge capital ships that they were, bringing in there. And of course, after even more digging, I actually found the maps in the National Archives of the bombing when the U.S. bombed all of those tanks and then leached the oil into the ground. And even later, this is the construction, China Petroleum rebuilt tanks there. So there's a lot of the kind of history of an oil soup under the site, which had to be cleaned and stopped the project for 3 years. But this is the structural being built. It was built, actually the structure was designed by Nanako and our professor of structures, Izzy Sinek, who died just before we won the competition. But his design was so good that it really remained unchanged. So you can see here the kind of view of the plan of the kind of structural lobes, the entrance road, and so forth. Kind of diagrid for the tower, and then it kind of shifts to these large trusses that hold the lobes. Going down, we really worked with poché was really important, the space between the walls where we could essentially keep the spaces relatively clean and put all of the circulation in between the walls. And it was a somewhat flexible system too, because there were changes made because of fire regulations and all of those things. So it was not a kind of fixed template, but we were able actually to work relatively flexibly by expanding the poché to accommodate zones of refuge and all of the kinds of requirements for a station like this. And this is a cross-section of the project. The other thing that got really interesting too, in this sense of a kind of notion of ground, that we actually had a number of datums for the structure to emerge off the surface. So from the highest deck, the building almost appears to sink into the deck, and then the main space is where most of the structure springs from, the main kind of public space. So I'm going to do a little detour related to my education and its relationship ultimately to the form of the terminal. There was, and this may be of interest to you or the teachers, but John Haydock, who was the dean at the Cooper Union in the 80s and 90s, would come up with exercises for the thesis students. The interesting thing there was he didn't really know, he deliberately created exercises that he didn't know what he would get. It was meant as a kind of speculation for himself as well as the students. It was a kind of test. And so he had an intuition that the students should draw musical instruments, intuiting that in a way the musical instrument was a kind of biomechanical thing, very close in a certain way to architecture itself. I never did the exercise, but I saw the drawings and I was totally blown away. My ambition was somehow to do something as great as those musical instrument drawings. In the 80s, I did, with Nanako, a clock tower, which was an anamorphic kind of stretch of a clock. But because I was, trained as a modernist, I realized that the clock didn't work. So it looked cool, but, it wasn't going to be like the clarinet, whatever. And so it was a problem that stayed with me. It was the problem of Haydock, and that became my problem. And then something really miraculous happened, and it was more or less an automatic thing. We were working on, the HVAC of the port terminal, and kind of developing the big spatial areas, but then the engineers went in and had to then run ducts. And I realized, I mean, that the quality of the duct work looked like the clarinet drawing. So I think we finally nailed it after 40 years, and we didn't do it. But anyway, there is a complex, anatomy to the whole project. So this showed the structure, then all of the stuff in between the walls in the second image, and then the various kind of layers of cladding, and all of the exercises we went through as well to try to reduce the amount of compound cladding in the project to make it cheaper. And actually, it was nicer when it was less smooth, more crisp. It was also a big enough project where you could do it. But anyway, I'll just kind of go through a number of images. Iwan Bon surprised us one day. We didn't know him. He said he wanted to photograph it. We had 24 hours, and he just did it. And he did some extraordinary images of the project. So this is, a view from the water. This is a view into the main hall. Nanako calls that truss on the left a dragon. This is actually looking towards the tower, so you can sort of get a sense of the vectors out from this. And then this is a kind of ticketing area. There are restaurants that kind of look down over the main hall as well, and commercial spaces on the boardwalk. So it was really, heavily programmed. There's even a kindergarten in the space. We didn't design it, but we left a place for it. People use it, they sleep, take naps in the tower. And just the very, the kind of knotting of the space and the kind of intersections that develop, for us, bring a certain dynamic. That element to the left with the reflecting light is a bar, a kind of club. And then here are some views from within the gardens at the lower level, and also the from the industrial level. And then, how the people in the city kind of view the behemoth. And I'll end with this video. These were filmed just at the opening, so restaurants have already been set up in some of these spaces, kind of overlook spaces. And then down at the kind of lowest level, actually the kind of columnar space below is used for markets. So it becomes a kind of multivalent, that they kind of understand that this place is so big it can be combined with the uses of the city. And finally, I have a little thing I'm going to show, which is more about something that has been troubling me. I created this medal, this Janus head, over the summer. Nanako was pretty annoyed with me because I spent an inordinate amount of time sculpting it myself and casting it. But it sort of reflects my anxiety about what's happening to the discipline of architecture. So around this, you see science and sustainability. It's a kind of, and then architecture above, history and identity on the other side. All of these are virtuous categories, But I fear that in a way, more and more the discipline is being abstracted. On the one hand, sustainability in a kind of a reductive way may simply be reduced to things like net zero building, but what kind of building is never said. So, I mean, it's both a virtue, but it's also not specifically architectural. It is an engineering derivation. On the other hand, there would also be, and this is probably more existential because I teach at Princeton where history theory is king, the inclination of particularly, first I would have to say that research and unpacking and looking at context is the work of historians, and situating projects is the proper work of historians. But what typically happens in the context of a design studio is that it becomes a kind of design deferral, because the research can be endless. And so it then becomes a problem from my perspective. So again, I don't want to be negative about all those categories, but I see the Janus head being torn in half and then a big zero occupying the place of the concrete design. So I think this is something that I see emerging. Again, you know, it's I start by making something, an allegory, and it's certainly, I have no final word on it, but it's just a situation I perceive. Anyway, I don't want to end negative, but I am. So, thank you.